Okay, so here we have government spending and government tax revenue across different countries. So you see that in the United States, government spending is about 35% of GDP, right? So we're expressing government spending as a percentage of GDP to kind of give us some ideas to the size that we're talking about. And then we see government revenue is about 31% of GDP. Government spending is greater than government revenue, so the US runs a budget deficit, right? The US has been running a budget deficit here for more than 20 years now, basically. Okay. What about if you compare the United States to other countries? Well, one of the things you see is that the US has a relatively small government, right? Government spending and tax revenue are roughly about the size that they are in Japan, but smaller than they are in Canada and France. And relative to other developed, rich countries, the US has a relatively small government spending as a percentage of GDP and government tax revenue as a percent of GDP. Let's look at each of these in kind of more detail, both the revenue part and the spending part. Okay, first off, we're looking at US tax revenue. And by the way, unless I say otherwise, I'm talking about the federal government here this morning, okay? So state and local governments are something else, right? There's something else. So those statistics are not included, right, in these statistics that I'm talking about. So we're just looking at the federal government. So how does the federal government collect its revenue? For the most part, you'll see that we collect revenue through income taxes. Either the personal income tax or social insurance taxes, which is basically your Social Security tax, which is another form of an income tax. Okay, so both social insurance taxes and personal income taxes are income taxes. And so the vast majority of tax revenue in the US is collected through income taxes. There's corporate profit taxes, right? Those are taxes that are imposed on corporations. And then the orange pie is other taxes, which in reality is a very big and eclectic collection of other taxes. But you really should think, I mean, if you know, I think an easy way to think about this is that the federal government collects about 2/3 of all of its income through income taxes. And as we've talked about, that makes the US unique because most countries do not rely nearly so heavily on income taxes, right? Most countries rely very heavily on consumption taxes. So we talked about, I think, the first week of this block about VAT taxes, value-added taxes, which are essentially sales taxes that are embedded within the price of goods. That is a more common way of collecting tax revenue in most countries than the system that the US uses, where we rely heavily on income taxes. What about government spending? All right, well, we see a little bit more complicated picture here. First off, notice that the federal government does a lot of different things, right? The blue here, or I guess the purplish blue, is Medicare and Medicaid. This is basically government spending on health insurance, which is about 20% of the US budget and growing very rapidly, as we're going to talk about. There's other goods and services. There's Social Security. There's education spending. There's national defense spending. There's other government transfers. This would include things like unemployment benefits and food stamps, those kind of things. And then finally, there's that red pie, which is interest payments, right? So the government, to pay these deficits, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, borrows money. And that money that they borrow has to be, an interest has to be paid on that. And so interest payments, believe it or not, we spend as much on interest payments as we do on national defense in this country, right? So that is a very, very big part of the pie. A very big part of the pie. So if we go back to this definition here that I showed you a minute ago of looking at government spending and breaking it into government purchases and transfer programs, one of the things that we see here is that most of government spending nowadays is in transfer programs. And if we look at government purchases, this is actually less than half of what the government spends its money on. Okay, so here's a big fallacy that is perpetuated by many politicians. The fallacy is somehow we can cut government spending and balance the budget without touching Social Security, Medicare, and national defense. The problem is there's just not that much left over, right? You can't significantly cut government spending without cutting without cutting national defense and transfer payment programs. You just can't. And so, right, I hear this all the time. Politicians will say, well, we can balance our budget. All we need to do is we just need to trim up the waste. We have too much waste in government. No, you don't have that much waste, right? You don't have that much waste. If we go back and look at this pie chart, okay, let's go around the pie here again. Interest payments, those are set. The government cannot impact those. Those are determined by the market and how much they've already borrowed. Medicare transfer program, very popular, particularly among old people who vote. Other goods and services, okay, there's about 17% of the budget. Social Security, very popular, particularly among old people who vote. Education, well, nobody wants to cut education. National defense, well, many people don't want to cut national defense. Other government transfer programs, okay, maybe some people want to cut those. So you have 11% of the budget and 17% of the budget. You have about 30% of the budget. And a lot of that stuff is very popular. So, there's just not a lot out there in the budget other than national defense, interest payments, and transfer payments, right? That is the biggest part of what the government does. And so, as you can tell, I've been kind of peeved by some politicians who talk about, well, it'd be so easy to balance the budget. All we have to do is, cut food stamps. Okay, that ain't going to get you even within shouting distance, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, by and large, the biggest thing our federal government does is it transfers money. And particularly it transfers money from people who work to people who are retired, right? Or for people who work or to people who are disabled, right? I mean, that is the biggest thing about what our government does. And so to think about balancing the budget without significantly impacting that stuff in any way is well, it's more than unlikely, right? It's more than unlikely. Now, I want to talk about deficits here in a couple of minutes, but before I do that, I want to kind of circle back to this question. Oh, actually, hold on. Let's see, Sonny's got a chat. Question: over time, will interest payments take larger and larger share of the spending? So that's actually a perceptive question, Sonny. It depends upon how fast the interest payments grow relative to how fast the pie grows, right? And by the pie, I basically mean the economy, right? So as the economy gets bigger, if the economy gets bigger at a faster rate than interest payments, then that piece of the pie will shrink. If interest payments get bigger at a faster rate than the pie, then the size of that pie is going to go up. And so that's the question, right? That's the question. Is interest going up faster than our economic growth rate? And well, I'm just going to stop there because we're going to come back and talk about these issues here in a couple of minutes, right? Before we get too much into the budget deficit, because that is obviously going to be one of the important things we talked about this morning, I want to kind of go back and talk about something that we talked about on Friday, which is stabilization policy. So can fiscal policy, and by fiscal policy, let's be clear what we mean. Government spending, tax collection, deficits be used to stabilize the economy and minimize business cycles. Right? Can we use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy and to prevent, or at least minimize, business cycles? So let's talk about Keynesian fiscal policy. When we think about Keynesian fiscal policy, oftentimes economists use this phrase because I think it's kind of a descriptive phrase about what economists or what policy should be doing during a recession, is that we want policy to lean against the wind. We want policy to lean against the wind. What in the world does that mean? Right, what does that mean? Well, let's think about a couple of examples here. So I'm going to draw two aggregate demand, aggregate supply graphs. Okay. So how do Keynesians think that fiscal policy should respond? So I want to talk about two examples here. Let's first think about a Keynesian recession that's caused by a fall in aggregate demand. And then we're going to talk about a Keynesian expansion that's caused by a big rise in aggregate demand. Okay, so here in the first case, aggregate demand falls and output falls. And so we fall below the natural rate of output, right? This is a Keynesian recession. Why did aggregate demand fall? Well, it could be because of the loss of consumer confidence, right? A typical Keynesian kind of recession. In the second example, we're at the natural rate, and now aggregate demand begins to grow too fast. And so now output is actually above the natural rate. Okay. Let's talk about each of these examples here and how the government should respond. Colin, how about you help me out with the recession here? So we've had a recession. Output has fallen below the natural rate. According to Keynes, what should the government try to do here when you're in a recession?
Increase the government spending.
Right. So if I can just take one step out, you're right. One thing they could do is increase government spending, but more generally, they want to increase aggregate demand, right? They want to increase aggregate demand, right? And you're right. How could they do that during fiscal policy? One of your suggestions is right. They could increase government spending, right? That's one way to increase aggregate demand. What would be another way of increasing aggregate demand?
Decrease the taxes.
Cut taxes, right? Cut taxes. And notice in both cases, Keynes would argue that you should run a deficit during a recession. That running a deficit during a recession makes all the sense in the world because you're trying to stimulate output. So leaning against the wind, right? Why does leaning against the wind? Well, basically whatever the momentum in the economy is, you want to be using government policy to push against that. So in this case, when the economy begins to slow, what should the government policy be doing? Trying to speed it up, right? So basically, when the economy is slowing down, it's fiscal policy's goal to hit the accelerator, right? To hit the accelerator. And so how do they hit the accelerator? By increasing spending or cutting taxes, right? Either way, that's going to increase aggregate demand and try to move output back to the natural rate. Now, that's half of the story though, right? That's half of the story because sometimes the wind is not in your face, the wind is in your back. So let's talk about this example of an expansion. Here, aggregate demand has gone up even when we are at the natural rate. Now we're actually above the natural rate of output. And what's the problem with being above the natural rate of output? Look what's happening to inflation. It's starting to go up, right? We're starting to grow at a rate that's unsustainable in the long run. All right, so Logan L, help walk me through here. In this case, what do you think the fiscal policy should be that the government should run?
They would want to do the opposite, right? So they'd want to increase taxes and then limit government spending to bring the aggregate demand back down.
Right. Right, they want to lower aggregate demand. So we can go up to our graph here, lower aggregate demand, drive output back to the natural rate, but also drive inflation back down. How do they lower aggregate demand? By cutting government spending, raising taxes, and also very importantly here, lowering the deficit. Maybe running a surplus even. Meaning collect more taxes than you have spending. So there was one chairman of the Federal Reserve who said that it's the government's responsibility to take away the punch bowl right when the party gets started, okay? And that's kind of the idea here. We want the economy to grow fast, but we do not want it to grow too fast. Because if it grows too fast, it's gonna grow at an unsustainable rate, and it's gonna begin to increase inflation. So it's at that point that the government actually wants to back off, right? They back off by lowering the deficit, cutting spending, and raising taxes. Note, in the long run, the government would run a balanced budget according to Keynes. In other words, sometimes you run deficits, but other times you run surpluses. over the long haul, that will even itself out. Keynes believed that fiscal policy, particularly government spending, believe that fiscal policy and particularly government spending is a powerful tool to stabilize output during a recession. Why? Why did Keynes believe that this is so powerful? Well, Keynes believed in the existence of fiscal policy multipliers. Okay? What is a fiscal policy multiplier? Well, that's kind of our next question here. What is a fiscal policy multiplier, and how does this help us understand why Keynes thought that fiscal policy was so powerful, right, in stimulating output? So let me ask you a question. If government spends $1 billion more, let me ask you this question. If government spends $1 billion more, will GDP rise by more or less than $1 billion?
I'm assuming since it's called a multiplier, more.
Zach, yeah, good one. Way to pay attention. Yeah, exactly, by more. And that's why Keynes thought that government spending could be very powerful in increasing GDP during recessions. Let me explain why, okay? So first off, I need to talk about this concept called the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is the change in spending from $1 in new income. So, for example, if your marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, and you're walking down the street and you find $1 in new income, how much of that dollar do you spend?
75 cents.
75 cents. And what happens to the other quarter?
Save it.
Yeah. So the marginal propensity to consume is just trying to capture this idea that people, whenever they have new income, they spend some of it and then they save some of it. So let's think of an example here. And granted, this is a ridiculous example. The government spends $100 billion, and let's say that the U.S. government decides they're going to build a naval base in Mount Vernon. Okay, because I mean, why would you want a naval base in Mount Vernon? So they're going to build a naval base in Mount Vernon, and it's going to cost $100 billion to do that. Okay. So let's think about what happens to aggregate expenditure. Right? Let's think about what's the change in aggregate expenditure. So what happens at the beginning of this? The government spends $100 billion, right? So what's the change in aggregate expenditure?
$100 billion.
100 billion, right? Which is also the change in new income, because remember, aggregate expenditure is equal to aggregate income. So this new spending becomes also new income for people. Now, here's the kicker though. When people get new income, what do they do with this new income? They spend it, right? This new income is going to get spent. How much of this new income gets spent in the next round? Well, if the MPC is 0.75, how much of this $100 billion is going to go, this $100 billion in new income is going to go into new spending? $75 billion, right? $75 billion of this new income gets spent. That new spending becomes somebody else's new income. What do these people do with that new income? They spend it, right? So where's my calculator? What's 75% of 75? 56.25. That will create 56.25 in new spending, which then becomes somebody's new income. What do people then do with this money? They spend it, which creates new income, which creates new spending, which creates new income, which creates new spending, right? Hopefully you can see how this is working.
Do they have an index that measures like the time it takes for people to spend?
Well, that's actually a good question. And as we're going to talk about that is one complication to this whole thing. Is to say that there's a multiplier doesn't mean that the multiplier takes place like that, right? So, if you don't think there's if this all sounds a little strange, I don't know if any of you have ever visited an Army base, but actually, if you visit an Army base, you actually see the multiplier process in action. Because what happens when they build a base? Well, they build a base, and that creates income for contractors and for the soldiers. And then what do the contractors and soldiers do with the income that they earn? They go to McDonald's and they go to strip malls and whatever. And so if you ever go to an Army base, what are they surrounded by? Shopping centers and fast food joints and haircut places, right? And then what are those areas surrounded by? Well, the people who work in there are surrounded by houses and schools and all the things in which more spending leads to more income, leads to more spending. The key thing here is to recognize that if the government spends $10 more, that's not the end of the story, right? That's not the end of the story. New spending actually leads to new income, which leads to new spending, which leads to new income. You can actually quantify this. You can actually show that the maximum government spending multiplier can be calculated as the following. Right, the government spending multiplier is the change in output you get from a change in government spending. The change in output you get relative to a change in government spending. And with a little bit of math, I'm not going to ask you to replicate this math, but I will ask you to know this formula, that the maximum government spending multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Once again, that's the maximum, all right? And what do I mean by the maximum? This is the biggest change in output you're going to get for a change in government spending. So in our example, what was the change in government spending? 100 billion. And what was the marginal propensity to consume? 0.75. So if we plug into this formula, we can solve for the change in government, we can solve for the change in GDP that comes about from this change in government spending. That in this example, GDP would change by 400 billion. All right, it would change by 400 billion. 4 times that. So our multiplier here is actually 4, right? 1 over 1 minus 0.7, 1 over 1 minus 0.75 is equal to 4. So our government multiplier is 4 here. So yeah, government spending can be powerful. At least, according to Keynes and according to this theory, some government spending actually will have a disproportionately big effect on GDP. So as we talked about a little bit last week, Keynes was a big believer in government purchases, right? He viewed that as a very powerful way of influencing GDP. I'm going to come back here in a minute, though, to remind us that we have to think about this, though. This formula really gives us the maximum change. In reality, the change is likely to be smaller than this, and I'm going to talk about why. Okay, I'm going to talk about some potential issues with this here, critique this a little bit. But for right now, just note that this is the maximum change in output. Is there such a thing as a tax multiplier or a transfer payment multiplier? Yeah, yeah. Just like there's a government spending multiplier, there's a tax or transfer payment multiplier. So let's just do that same example where the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 again. But now the government cuts taxes by 100 billion. Or, and actually maybe let's work this example. How about stimulus checks of 100 billion? That's really the same idea. Whether you tax people 100 billion, whether you cut their taxes by 100 billion or you give them a stimulus check of 100 billion. But let's actually do this example. But I do want you to recognize that really, in many ways, these are the same examples. Cutting taxes or giving people a stimulus check of 100 billion will have the same effect. Okay, so the government sends out $100 billion in stimulus checks. People get those stimulus checks. Now they've got $100 billion sitting in their pocket. So Nevaeh, according to this example, how much of that $100 billion do they spend?
75 billion.
75 billion. And that new spending then becomes somebody else's new income. What do these people do with their new income? They spend it. And that new spending then becomes somebody else's new income. What do these people do with their new income? They spend it. So there is a multiplier effect here again. The change in output, the change in income, is going to be bigger than that initial change in government spending. Does anybody notice, though, a difference in this example versus the government spending example? Notice anything different in this example? Look at round one. What was the change in government's, what was the change in expenditure in round one? Yeah, as Sunny says, notice here that the first round of expenditure was only $75 billion. Why? You gave people a stimulus check, but they did not spend every cent of the stimulus check. They saved some of it. But what happens when we have the government spend the money? They spent every single cent. That first round, you're getting more bang for your buck. You're getting more spending in that first round because the government doesn't save it. They spend everything. So you start off with $100 billion in aggregate expenditure, where in this example, you actually start off with less than that, right? The result is there's a smaller multiplier here. You get a smaller multiplier than the government spending multiplier. you can show that the maximum tax transfer multiplier is the following. Sorry, I'm struggling with my skills here. The maximum the maximum tax transfer multiplier is the change in output divided by the change in either taxes or transfers. And that's equal to this, but notice here, don't mess this up. This actually has to be a negative number. Why negative? Because remember that when you cut taxes, output goes up. Or when you give transfers, output has to go up. Actually, yeah, this is, now that I look at this, I didn't think about this morning. This is actually a little confusing, isn't it? Because you think of a tax cut, but really a tax cut is the same thing as a positive transfer. Yeah, okay, so you have to be careful about this, this negative sign here, right? You have to be careful and think about this clearly so that you know which way the government is changing output. So in this example, remember the MPC is equal to 0.75, and we gave people a transfer of 100 billion, which is like a tax cut of 100 billion, right? A tax cut of 100 billion. So what's the change in output from this change in T? We just plug everything in. Okay, plug everything in. What do we get here? Here, output goes up by 300 billion. Right, output goes up by 300 billion. So note that the change in output from a change in G is bigger than the change in Y from a change in T, right? That we get a bigger change in GDP from changing government purchases than we got from cutting taxes or transfer payments. And that was Keynes's point, right? That was Keynes's point. That's why government purchases, in Keynes's opinion, was the most powerful tool that governments had to stimulate output because it has the biggest multiplier, right? It has the biggest multiplier. Okay, let's think a little bit here more deeply about multipliers. Okay. First off, one of the critiques, well, actually, let's say that for a second here. When we talk about multipliers, one of the things to recognize is that many government programs serve as automatic stabilizers. Government programs in which government spending and taxes adjust automatically to changes in government spending. No, not changes in government spending, changes in GDP. Right? Government programs in which spending and taxes adjust automatically to changes in GDP. This is things like unemployment benefits, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare. In other words, our tax collections. All of these are programs in which spending and taxes adjust automatically to changes in GDP. Okay, so think about a situation where output falls and we go into a recession. What happens automatically? More people qualify for welfare. More people get unemployment benefits. More people qualify for food stamps. Meaning automatically, government spending goes up. And Congress and the president don't even have to do anything. This is the way that these programs are designed to work. They're designed to be automatic stabilizers that kick in automatically. The same holds with our tax code. When your income goes down, your taxes go down. Because of your income taxes. So automatically your income taxes go down. Because when your income goes down, as GDP falls, your taxes go down. What does this mean? The deficit immediately goes up. But for our purposes, it's also really important to notice that this stimulates aggregate demand and it pushes output back up a little bit. It's a stabilizer. So output falls, and then these programs kick in to push output back up. They don't have to go through the political process. That's one of the real advantages of these social safety net programs, right? And that's what we could call these, the social safety net. These are things that kick in automatically when the economy begins to slow down. They don't have to go through the usual political process because that's the way that these programs are designed to work. These help to minimize the size of the recession. So things like unemployment benefits are actually intended to minimize the size of recessions. And of course, to provide a social safety net to workers. There's one other result to this. Because of the way that our social safety net is set up and the way that automatic stabilizers are set up, deficits are always going to rise during recessions. They always rise during recessions. And we're going to look at some data here in a minute. You will not be surprised to know that our deficits rose over the last year because of COVID. And a lot of it is because of these social safety net, these automatic stabilizers, right? More spending on welfare, unemployment benefits, Medicaid, right? These kind of things that are intended to protect people, right, from the worst of a recession and to try to stabilize aggregate demand. Okay. So these kind of programs are distinctly Keynesian, right? This is just what Keynes wanted to see, right? And in many ways, the way that these programs are set up is they're set up in a Keynesian nature to be stabilizers. To have that leaning against the wind process take place automatically. All right. So we've kind of established here in the first hour some facts about the government deficit and budget. And we've established kind of the Keynesian view, right, of how fiscal policy is supposed to be managed. So let's take a little bit of break, and then I'm going to kind of talk about the critique of Keynesian fiscal policy, right? What are some of the arguments against it? And then I, very importantly, want to talk about budget deficits, right? Budget deficits, budget debt, and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, and try to get that horrendous picture that Nevaeh has on her Zoom out of my mind, right? That's going to give me, I don't like cats as it is, and I certainly don't like that cat. That's creepy. All right, so how about 5 minutes? Actually, maybe like at 1:10, we'll come back here and we'll critique Keynes and talk a little bit about deficits and debt. See you in a couple. Time and time again, right? That's something we find time and time again when we talk about fiscal policy. And that's one of the things that is contributing to a greater and greater budget deficit over time. So let's talk about the US budget deficit. Okay. The US government budget deficit and debts. Okay. Let's first off distinguish between the deficit and the debt. The deficit is the yearly borrowing, right? The yearly borrowing. So we would think about the government surplus as being tax revenue minus government purchases minus transfer payments. Remember, we call these things together government spending. So the government surplus is really the difference between tax revenue and government spending. And of course, when the surplus is less than zero, which it is in the US, we call that a deficit. Right? So we have not had a government surplus in the US since 1993, I think. So basically for 20 years, and we'll look at some data here in a minute, that illustrates that, right? The key thing about the deficit, it's the yearly shortfall. What is the debt? That's the total accumulated borrowing. Right, the total accumulated borrowing.
Sorry, really quick. What does that say after tax revenue minus government something?
Tax revenue minus government purchases.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. You can't read that? That's clear. My writing is pristine. Yeah, I'm not even sure I can read my own writing. Purchases. Yes, that's supposed to say purchases. All right, so the deficit, which is the yearly borrowing, versus the debt, which is the accumulated borrowing. And this is what we pay interest on. We pay interest on this accumulated debt. Okay. Usually, we express both as a percentage of GDP. In other words, to put it in kind of some relative perspective. Okay. So we'll talk about, for instance, the deficit, the GDP ratio, and the debt to GDP ratios. That's how economists tend to think about the deficit and the debt, as a percentage of how big our economy is. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of data here. This is what I wanted to look at. Yeah, I think so. So this is from the Congressional Budget Report, looking at some recent deficit and debt numbers. Sorry, dang it, this is not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. Can everybody see this? This is these purple lines. So the top figure here is looking at the deficit as a percent of GDP, right? Once again, as a percent of GDP. And so you can see here, beginning in 1970, when it's below zero, that means it's a deficit. And when it's above zero, that means it's a surplus. So we see that we ran a deficit in the 70s and began to dramatically run bigger deficits in the 1980s. For a brief period of time in the 1990s, actually, yeah, I was way off on my timing. I don't know what I was thinking here. We actually ran a surplus here in the late 1990s. But then since basically about 2000, we've been running deficits. And then you can see the dramatic deficit that we began to run during the 2008 global financial crisis, right? And in part, this reflects the fact that those automatic stabilizers kicked in. And whenever you have a recession, you're going to have a bigger deficit. And then this also reflected the fact that there were big stimulus packages. And then you can also see where the deficit began to increase here in 2020. That's because of the COVID slowdown, right? Because of COVID slowdown. But notice our deficit was getting worse even before COVID, right? Under Trump, the deficit continued to increase. Even though we had strong economic growth, the deficit got bigger, right? And so That's typically not what we see, what we would expect to see, not what we'd hope to see. In the second figure, we see the debt to GDP ratio. And you can see what's happened here to the debt in the US over time. And as a percentage of GDP, the debt has gone up dramatically here since basically 2008, right? We're coming close to reaching World War II levels of debt. And as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, if you look at the projected, meaning past 2020 into 2030, 2050, you can see that projected deficits are just getting bigger and bigger. And we'll talk about why projected deficits are going up. Okay. So that gives you some idea here as to what our debt and deficit looks like. Sorry, my computer is kind of freezing up here. What the hell happened? Okay. How does the US budget and debt look relative to other countries? This data is a little dated, but I think it'll give you a rough idea as to where the US ranks relative to other countries. So you can see some countries that have big debt as a percent of GDP. Right up at the top of this list is Greece and Japan. Now, that's actually really interesting because Greece and Japan are two of the countries that have the highest levels of debt. Greece has had a debt crisis. Japan appears to be in no danger of having a debt crisis. How is it that these two countries can have such different experiences with debt? We'll talk about that here in a minute. But if you see the United States, the US actually looks a lot like a lot of other rich and developed countries, as has a relatively high levels of debt, right? Or definitely levels of debt around 90 to 100% of GDP, roughly. So the US doesn't look, completely out of whack relative to other developed countries. What's going on here with Norway? Well, it's good to be Norway. Norway is, you might know, is sitting on a huge reserve of oil. And so Norway, being the smart, prudent country that it is, basically takes this oil and invests it. So they have actually a huge sovereign wealth fund, right? Instead of a sovereign debt, they have a wealth fund. And so they actually have a negative debt, meaning they have basically an amount almost stored up to 100% of GDP. And so it's good to be Norway, right? Very nice to be Norway. So why should we worry about this? Should we be worried about all this debt? Well, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons that you should be worried about that. But I am also going to talk about some of the reasons why the US is somewhat of a special case. And so just to alleviate your fears right off the bat, right? If you're worried that this is another one of these depressing lectures where Noop is going to tell us that we're all going to hell in a handbasket, no. At the end of this lecture, I'm actually going to talk to you about why, really the debt situation in the US is not particularly dire, right? Not to say that it's not a concern, but it's not particularly dire, in part because the US is a little bit different than most other countries, right? For some reasons we'll talk about. All right, so what are the dangers of debt? Well, one of the biggest dangers of debt is there's the opportunity cost. there's a big opportunity cost. That we spend about 12% of our total spending on paying interest on the debt. We could be spending this on other things. For those of you who would like more government scholarships for your college, or you would want, high-speed rail, or you want this, or you want that. Well, part of the reason we don't have money for all of these things is that we spend quite a big fraction of government spending on paying interest on the debt. And not just in terms of the direct amount of interest that we pay, in terms of like the dollar figure, but it is true that government deficits drive up interest rates. And this is what we call crowding out. Crowding out is the idea that government deficits drive up interest rates. And as a result, they hurt investment and long-run growth. How does that work? Well, let's think back to our good old friend, the loanable funds market. Right, so remember the loanable funds market when we talked about savings and investment, and that determines the equilibrium interest rate within your economy. And let's just assume that we have a closed economy here, so savings equals investment. So we'll keep it simple with a closed economy. What happens when the government runs bigger deficits? That reduces savings in your economy. Part of the savings is private savings plus government savings. And so when governments run bigger deficits, what they're doing is they're reducing total savings in the economy. What does that do? Pushes up interest rates. And it makes it more expensive to invest, and it could hurt long-run growth. So this is a real danger. Okay, so look at this figure. Just to kind of show you this effect at work. Here's the interest rate on a 10-year government bond in Greece and the interest rate on a 10-year government bond in Germany. Okay? As Greece borrowed more and more, what happened to their interest rates? They went up and up and up, right? And look at during the worst of the debt crisis, Greece was borrowing at 25 to 30% a year, right? That's astronomical. That's a catastrophe to be borrowing at that rate. While Germany is borrowing at 1 or 2% a year, right? Why the difference? Germans save, the Greeks don't, right? If you save a lot, you're going to have low interest rates. If you don't save a lot, you're going to have high interest rates. And so, this is one of the big dangers. Right? This is one of the big dangers. And in fact, things got so bad in Greece that eventually Greece found it impossible to borrow anymore. And that's what we call a debt crisis. What's a debt crisis? A debt crisis is just simply governments, or when a government finds it impossible to borrow more from markets. When a government finds it impossible to borrow more from markets. In other words, they experience what's known as a sudden stop in bond markets, where the market freaks out and they don't lend anymore. When does this happen? Does it happen when your GDP ratio gets to 50%? 100%? 150%? Do I hear 200%? 300%? Who wants to chime in here? What's the number at which this happens? Logan says, does it happen at a random number? Or no, I'm sorry, that's Faith. I wouldn't say it's random, but I like what Logan says in the comment above. It depends on the country. And that is it exactly. It completely depends. It completely depends upon when a debt crisis happens. What does it depend upon? It depends upon what we call, as economists, debt tolerance. Debt tolerance is how credible do markets find a country's promise to repay their debt. Do they find it credible? The key word here is credible. Do markets find it credible that you're going to pay back your debt? When they lose that confidence, that's when you have a debt crisis. It's the loss of confidence that almost always leads to a debt crisis. It's not hitting a magic number. It's something occurs that causes markets to lose confidence. Now, in the real world, debt tolerance depends on a lot of things. Let me ask you, give me some ideas of things that are going to improve markets' confidence that a country is going to repay its debt. In other words, what are some factors about a country that might make it a credible promise that they're going to repay their debt? Faith says paying off existing debts. Exactly. Right? This history of paying debt, I don't know if any of you guys, most of you probably seen Hamilton, the musical, right? if you don't remember this from American history, maybe you'll remember it from Hamilton, the musical. But if you remember, there was this big debate when the US adopted the Constitution as to what the federal government was going to do about state debt. And many people were arguing that states should just default on their debt. Be like, let's default and let's start over from scratch. And it was Alexander Hamilton, among others, who was arguing you cannot default. Why? Because that's going to impact us big time in the future. How do we prove to creditors, how do we prove to markets that we will pay our debts and be able to borrow more in the future? We pay our debts, right? If we want to borrow more later, we have to pay our debts now. And so that was why Hamilton argued that the federal government should assume the state's debts from the Revolution, because that was a way to create debt tolerance. And he was right about that, right? So why is it that Greece and Japan have similar levels of debt, but it's Greece that had a debt crisis and Japan didn't? Japan pays its debt, plain and simple. Greece doesn't, right? It's the history, right? And then it's also what Logan Wells says here. You also have to have some sort of stable government, right? In other words, some kind of belief that the government's actually capable of paying its debt. Also having a stable economy and having growth is an important part of paying your debt. To put this another way, this really gets back to this concept of institutions, right? Do the institutions in your country exist so that governments are encouraged to engage in productive behavior like paying off their debts? Or to what extent does the government just simply see debt as a way of stealing money from people? You issue debt and then you never pay it back. And that is legitimately how many countries view their debt, right? They really view their debt as a means of which you can essentially steal money from the public, right? I'll borrow money today, maybe I'll pay it back, probably not, right? And of course, when that happens again and again and again, markets have no debt tolerance for you, right? So you look at a country like Argentina. Argentina, since 1980, has had 6 different debt crises. 6 different times it's defaulted on its debt, right? What's true about Argentina's debt to GDP ratio? It's actually quite low because nobody will lend money to Argentina in the first place. You can't trust it. Strangely enough, the fact that Japan has so much debt actually tells you a lot about how much debt tolerance they have. That markets keep on lending money to Japan because markets believe that Japan will repay. So you have this strange situation where having more debt actually means you're more likely to repay the debt, right? Simply because you're more likely to borrow from somebody who you think is going to repay you, right? And so, debt tolerance is really the key at understanding when debt crises happen, right? What happens when you have a debt crisis? What are the impacts? What kind of things happen in your economy as a result of this? Well, usually a lot of things happen, right? Usually more than just 1 or 2 things happen. But one thing that clearly happens is your government is forced into what's called austerity. And austerity is a fancy word that basically means you have to cut spending and raise taxes to reduce your deficit. So undoubtedly, one of the things going to happen is that government spending is going to drop dramatically and tax revenues are probably going to have to go up because there's no way that you can borrow anymore. Historically, this has led to big falls in aggregate demand and recessions. When governments are forced to cut spending so dramatically, as they often are, sometimes these are cuts in government spending of 20 or 30%. That's going to be a big fall in aggregate demand. Usually a country is going to experience huge spikes in interest rates. It's going to be a lot more difficult, not just for the government to borrow, but for anybody to borrow. This will also reduce aggregate demand and worsen the recession. Usually, a country will also experience a banking or a financial crisis. Banks are typically the largest, if not one of the largest holders of government debt, government bonds. Right? Banks hold lots of government bonds. And so what happened if the government default on their bonds?
So do the banks.
So do the banks. And then you have this huge collapse in lending and falls in aggregate demand and big recessions. So usually when you have a debt crisis, you're going to have a financial crisis too of some way, shape, or form. Banks are going to fail. Financial markets are going to collapse. The stock market might, drop to nothing. Now, there is one other thing that often happens. These three things are no good, right? So sometimes countries say, hey, maybe I can avoid the first three through a little trick. Maybe I'll just print up some money to pay off my bonds that way. I will, quote unquote, monetarize my debt, meaning I turn my debt into money. And so countries have done this. Countries have said, I can't pay my bonds. I can't pay for anything. How do I keep paying for the things that I want as a government? Let's just turn on the printing press. I'm going to turn on the printing press and I'm going to just start printing up money like crazy. We'll kind of come back to this tomorrow when we talk about monetary policy. But almost inevitably, this leads to hyperinflations. And what's hyperinflation? Inflation of greater than 1,000% a year or more. We have seen this time and time again in US history where countries have had astronomical inflation rates, right? Astronomical inflation rates. How do those usually start? They almost always start with a debt crisis. The government can't pay its bills. They have people that need to be paid. So what do? They say, well, I don't want austerity and I don't want a banking crisis, so I'm just going to start printing up money. But and we're going to connect the dots on this a little bit more tomorrow when we begin talking about monetary policy. But what's the inevitable impact of printing up more money? Inflation. The more money you print up, the higher your inflation rate's going to be. And some countries have taken this to the extreme, right? Extreme. So having a debt crisis is just not simply is simply a bad idea. Most of you, or maybe some of you, remember, well, this crisis is really kind of going on, but you'll be somewhat familiar with the Greek debt crisis, which really began in 2009, and in some ways is continuing on today. Let me just give you a brief timeline of this to kind of explain how the Greek debt crisis happened. And I think it will kind of illustrate some of the things that we talked about. The European Monetary Union was created in 2000. And basically that meant that the countries that were in the European Monetary Union all had the same currency, the euro. And so what did this do? This greatly increased the amount of money that Greece could borrow. So Greece immediately started borrowing money like there was no tomorrow. And they needed this money to prop up a weak economy, weak governments, and an aging population. So Greece said, hey, now that we're in the euro, it's a lot easier for us to borrow money. And so let's borrow. Let's go crazy. And that's essentially what they did, right? Greece had a very bloated government, right? In Greece, before the crisis, a man could retire at the age of 55 and get government assistance. And some women could retire at the age of 50, okay? So you can imagine there huge increases in government spending were needed for this. Greece only had about a 30%, what's the word I'm looking for? 30% collection rate for taxes. So in other words, about 70% of all taxes in Greece went uncollected because so many people were simply not paying their taxes. So just huge, inefficient government. Governments that would fail all the time and would be replaced by another government. And this is essentially what happened in 2009, where a government failed, a new government came in, and they said, you know what? You know how the last government said that the deficit was going to be about 10% of GDP? Well, it's 18% of GDP. And markets flipped out, as they probably should have, right? And so what happened was that the debt crisis. Greece couldn't borrow. They had to have big austerity, meaning they had to cut government spending and try to raise taxes. And they had a big recession. There are two policies that helped Greece, and we should probably talk about these a little bit. Because there are a couple of things that governments can do when they have a debt crisis. One, is they can ask bondholders to take a haircut. Anybody familiar with this saying? What does take a haircut mean in financial lingo? Anybody ever heard of this, to take a haircut? Ever heard of this before, Gabe?
Can't say I have.
Never heard of taking a haircut. All right. So what is a haircut? Basically, bondholders agree to take some of their money back, not all of it, right? In the Greece case, bondholders basically took a 50% haircut. They said, give us half the money back. Why would a bondholder agree to just take 50% of their money back?
Because it's better than getting nothing back.
It's better than zero, right? That's it exactly. A lot of bondholders just simply said, give me 50. And so that is one thing that Greece was able to do. Something else that Greece was able to do is to get bailouts, basically loans, primarily from Germany. Why did the Germans help? Why was it the Germans who have periodically helped the Greeks? Because the Germans, Logan says, because they use the euro. That's definitely true. I don't think that in and of itself, they run a surplus. That's true. So Germans have the money. So are the Germans just like, these just very naturally giving people who really care about the well-being of Greece? Who owned all those Greek bonds? Germans did, and German banks did, right? This idea that Germany has over the years kind of put out this story about, oh, it's so hard for us to lend money to Greece. We're so kind. Bullshit, right? Why did the Germans help? Well, as Germans that owned a bunch of these Greek bonds, particularly German banks. Germany was worried about its own banking crisis. Right? Germany was worried about its own banking crisis. So no, this was not out of the warmth and generosity of German hearts. I'm not picking on Germans here. I mean, I guess I am a little bit, but not. I think this is true of a lot of countries, right? Usually when countries give bailouts, it's as much about what's in their own self-interest as it is about what's in the receiving country's self-interest here. And so Germany basically made the decision that they needed to help Greece out because they didn't want to have to bail out their own banks. It was easier to bail out the Greeks than it was to bail out their own banking system. And so, I talk about this because it just shows you how interconnected the global world is, right? Greece is an economy the size of Minnesota. It's an economy the size of Minnesota, and yet it threw basically all of Europe into this dizzying mess for, going on more than a decade now, right? It's kind of crazy, but it just goes to show you how interconnected the world is, right? How interconnected the world is. And so, yeah, budget deficits are not a great thing. So this afternoon, we're going to have a very short scheduled class. This afternoon, I just want to come back and talk about this question. Is the U.S. going to have a debt crisis? All right. So we'll talk about that question. That will only probably take about 20 minutes or so. And then after that, I would just really kind of like to have a review session. Either we can have it in a bigger group, or if not in a group, we can just have some office hours, all right? So most of this afternoon is just going to be kind of more free form. Those of you who want to talk to me either together or individually, we'll have some time for that, okay? So just covering a little bit more new material this afternoon, but for the most part, and if you feel like your time is better served studying or doing some other things, then by all means do that, okay? Okay, so I'll see you all back here at 12:30 to finish up chapter 13. All right, have a good lunch. See y'all.